first person, let's give you, would you like to meet?
So my first comment is to Zara, and then my question is also to Zara, but it interacts with Chigusa's talk. And that is that, so I think you agree with this, but what you say about accessibility makes perfect sense in comprehension, or in overextensions, like when kids use kitty. But as you pointed out at the end, there's a feedback loop, right? So you're hearing other people talk, and if some form is more accessible and they're using it more broadly, then for the listener, it becomes part of the new meaning for that word. So that through that kind of bootstrapping, it's going to be hard to tease apart in the terms of language change, because the higher frequency does go hand in hand with the broader meanings, right? Maybe because it's a matter of accessibility. But if I could just mention the other point, which is, and here again, I'm not sure that you disagree, but entrenchment basically says you get used to saying things and you stick with what you've heard, and the more you've heard it, the less you're willing to change. But in your experiment, there's an implicit contrast, right, between plural and singular. So when you're hearing one form more often, you're hearing it for one particular meaning as opposed to the other, because there are the others in that context. And so it's a subtle difference, but you know, I've been arguing that it's real, that competition is important, and it's not just that you don't change things you've heard frequently, it's that you don't change things that you've heard frequently in that context.
Yes.
If you haven't been in the other context, then you're free to change it. So entrenchment says you're just conservative across the board. But I think Chigusa's experiment actually indicates that this competition is important, right? Like, you've heard ka more frequently, numerically, with the things that tend to be plural, but it's because it's less memorable. It's the contrast between singulars and plurals that seems to matter.
Yeah, so I think our conversation goes back to the difference between preemption and entrenchment. Yeah. Is on. Okay, yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, so this distinction between entrenchment versus preemption, where meaning should limit the context in which frequent forms versus infrequent forms are analyzed. And I have to say, I mostly agree. I completely agree. I think preemption, again, is involved in most of these instances, especially when there are overextension, what we categorize as overextension errors in child language learning. And I think the only reason we kind of don't let go of this idea of entrenchment is that some of the findings that we have show that it is sometimes the case that the low frequency form is extending as opposed to the high frequency form, because the high frequency form is staying in its original meaning. So.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that finding. Like the Shu and Tannenbaum, the Dalmatian experiment,
Yes, yeah.
if it's a suspicious and it's a coincidence, because all things being equal, they would have chosen something else. So there's that implicit competition with other things. If you just happen to see 3 Dalmatians walking around together and you call them FEPs, you wouldn't have that narrowing. It's not just frequency. I think it's because you're specifically choosing one after one.
It's in a certain context, yeah. So what are the chances that every time I see a dog, it's Dalmatian?
Exactly.
Not very likely, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I cannot disagree with the preemption argument, I have to say.
Another question, I think.
Okay.
That's all. I have 2 questions because actually I'll go through the. Oh, sorry. Okay, I got it. First, just to suggestion by your last question, but I'm sure you thought of this, and I don't know about this kind of work. But have you thought of trying to teach participants 2 different artificial languages, both of which have optional plurality, then train them with ka and then ask them to produce in another language to distinguish whether it's the form of the meaning?
Bilingual artificial language learning. No, I mean, it's a fascinating idea, right? So the prediction is if you teach one language first, right? Like, for example, like this one, and you're teaching another language later, like in sequence, and then, or like simultaneously.
Simultaneously, because we want to know whether it's the plural meaning that they're computing the probability of or the form ka.
Oh, I see. No, clearly, I haven't thought about it. But it's an interesting idea. So if what you're extracting is the meaning predictability, you should be able to transfer that to another language. That's what you're suggesting, right? No, I mean, it's theoretically possible. It's fascinating. I haven't done it because it's difficult to do. Yeah.
And it was a challenge, obviously. And the other one is why in the second experiment did you make one set a little smaller and more insect-like and wispy if what you wanted to show is that this was all about the contextual statistics?
Yeah, it's a good question. We are actually running that version. So it's actually the 4th experiment was the replication of the 2nd experiment, except that all the shapes have the same size. And we didn't give any sort of color cues to see whether the statistics can be the only source of information that drives this effect or not. So it's undergoing. I will let you know what we find. We implemented the size difference just because we weren't sure whether people could do it or not. So we wanted to make sure that there is something to latch onto. And if they can do it, let's do it. Let's make it slightly more difficult. So that was the practical, pragmatic reason. Yeah.
So I also had a thought that maybe you've already thought about with respect to your last question. How do you tease apart the meaning from form frequency? Wondering whether there's any way to do it by using, English has lots of at least near synonyms where one might be much more frequent than another for a particular meaning. Is there any way that you could use that fact about language to tease it apart?
Like so far in couch, for example. Or that's not the
I don't know if there are frequency differences in that particular pair, but that's all.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. So in that case, the meaning predictability is supposed to be the same. We can refer to the same object by 2 names, and then you might have form frequency differences. How does that play out? Let me think about it. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it yet.
So the comment addressing Zara, the first comment sort of relates back to Ray's question to Annie earlier about when we think of these as evolution, think of language change evolution. I think your question, Ray, was, so where do we get this innovation from? How do people step outside the system? I thought this was your talk actually kind of answered that question very nicely. And my question for you was, so you talked about reiteration, and the reiteration again. And it's not really bleaching, it's more a matter of the change in accessibility. Would you say that that's, so just maybe just a clarification, are you saying that it's not bleaching at all, or that that's how bleaching occurs, that bleaching is a result of that process and coming out of this difference between comprehension and production?
So I think we do think bleaching is a prominent process in language change as a result of frequency, habituation, all of that. But we think that the frequency-driven accessibility change hasn't been paid much attention to, and so that's the one that we are interested in and we're trying to advocate for. Yeah, so I think actually that's this dynamic in general is very interesting because we are showing that in comprehension, meanings are not getting broader, it becomes narrower, they are becoming narrower, while a habituation account would argue that there should be directly, as a direct effect of frequency, there should be a broadening effect during the comprehension test. So for example, you would see them click more on diminutive plural and diminutive non-plural if they hear the diminutive suffix. Yeah, and so I think we find that very interesting that frequency can result in broadening, just bleaching of the semantic specifics, but that's not the case here, but still can result in extension through accessibility. I don't know if I answered the question, but okay.
Hi, also for Zara. Entrenchment, is that an effect that exists in natural language use, or is it only a laboratory effect? So if I talk about running down the street versus running for office or running a business, is there really any evidence that people are entrenched on the most common meaning of running and have any delay in comprehension of running for office or running a business?
I'd say so. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but it's definitely used. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that, well, it's been posed that it's how children care over generalization errors. Yeah, I have to think about that.
I mean, maybe initially in acquisition, but once they become,
I would say,
in adult language users, is there any evidence that we really entrench with frequent words on one initial meeting? Because so many, as you know, as you started out saying, high frequency words tend to have multiple senses, and I don't think we typically have.
I'm trying to think of a priming study where this has been shown.
I have one, Thomas Hörberg. I have a suggestion. Thomas Hörberg, who just finished his dissertation, worked on this and measured it, did fMRI studies and showed that the higher frequency words have less surprisal effects in the brain. You get less surprised when they appear.
When they appear with their or what?
When
What does that speak to?
so if you have running for office, she is running for office, or she's running in the forest, running for office, then running would, for office, so as soon as you start for office, you would get a higher spike of surprisal in the brain, which indicates that you are primed to expect a more frequent.
It's very context dependent, right? Like the salty peanut experiment, if you know what I mean. Where if you're in the context of So the experiment sets up this peanut who's in love and who meets another peanut, and then the context is the salty peanut, and you get this big N400 because in that context it's very weird. Whereas if you say the peanut in love, there's nothing. So it depends, how your context sets it up.
And also it goes back to Petra's word, yesterday, right? Polysemy were like the same word, two different meanings, and then of course frequency effects.
Yes, I just had a short question for Zara, or just something to think about. We spend a lot of time talking about examples of shifts, but not as much about what happens when we kind of lose the shifted case. So we have iteration, reiteration. and other examples of redundant morphology, which seems to be motivated by the greater accessibility or maybe loss of transparency of the original base or meaning. There's an interesting development along the lines of irregardless. In the 17th century, a whole class of forms began to appear for negative adjectives. Examples are unguiltless, unhelpless, unmatchless, unmerciless, and in each case there's redundancy. So, as you might predict from the general fact that you don't get words like uncruel as opposed to unkind, as is well known, that un doesn't attach to negative meaning adjectives. So the only meaning that these could have, and the meaning that they did have, was guiltless and matchless and so forth, where the un was entirely redundant and added no value. But what the other interesting question is, why and how did these forms disappear? So it's not as if they took over and now we only talk about things being unmatchless and unmerciless. We've gone back to the previous state, except for random examples like irregardless, German unzweifellos, literally undoubtless. But these are the exceptions rather than the rules. So, what are the forces that led to the disappearance? It hasn't happened with reiteration, obviously. You might speculate some sort of prescriptive grammarians got upset, but I don't know that that's the case with these un-X-less forms.
It has crossed my mind, but no, I was going to speculate that is it possible it's phonological? So due to reduction?
Well, there is more effort involved, but that's true of reiteration also. And there's a whole family of examples. In other words, there was a rule that existed, and then the rule disappeared. And it's just interesting to think about what the different forces are that might have been in competition with each other.
Yeah. Can I just go back to this question about entrenchment appearing in adults? I think, and I don't remember unfortunately the exact citation, I'm not sure if it was Ben Average's work, one of the works, or it was Dixon, but they do have adult data, and adults do show entrenchment. In one of those papers, I wish I knew which one exactly it was, but yeah, there are with these verbs that are used in a different context. So he arrived me to school, he came me to school kind of verbs. They show that adults do have this tendency as well. But again, I don't remember which one it was exactly. So
Yeah, and that's what Del said, is it completely?
yes.
He's revised all of his old data. So that you can't tease apart entrenchment and preemption in his data. We have time for one more question.
Just a tiny question before she goes up. So, have you tested things from collectives? So, like herd of, I forget the animals, so herd of cows, where the meaning is of an individual, a larger individual, the collective, but you're using plural morphology. Right, so here the marker is not really talking about, so you're talking about the herd, or the group, or the swarm, or the school of love.
Right.
And so that would be a way of, like, in a different direction, teasing out the marker from the meaning.
Right, it's an interesting point. We haven't done anything empirically, but we have thought about it. So, like, if we are to create a system, right, or for example, if we add a new lexical item that we a group of part of, and then we introduce it in this type of artificial language, my prediction is that it gets omitted quite often when you're presented with multiple objects. But obviously you can't do that in the same way. We have thought about the question, and then also we thought about cases like scissors, right? Like, you can perceive it as one unit, but since English has this plural s, you use scissors as plural often. And also chopsticks, two parts, but you can't perceive it as one unit as well, right? So if we introduce these items as visual items, and if we somehow communicate to learners that, well, you know, you can see multiple parts, but it's actually one unit, right? Then they might behave differently from all the other multiples or plurals that are kind of like a collection of independent items altogether. And our prediction is that in the cases of scissors, glasses, and well, chopsticks, all these items, since the meaning of multiple parts is so salient, people will be less likely to use a word plural meaning for these items. So we have thought about it, but we haven't done any experiments just yet.
Well, thank you very much. Time's up.
So we
So we have a break.